The room was too cold. You remember that? How cold the funeral home kept the room, even in April. The smell of flowers that had been there too long. The casket was open. You had not expected that. He was 29. You had known him for years. Not a best friend, something more complicated than that. The kind of person who shows up at the right moment and becomes someone you don't categorize. Cancer. 8 months from the first appointment to this room. 8 months. You stood near the casket, and a woman from his church, someone you had never met, put a hand on your shoulder and said the sentence. God needed him more than we did. You nodded. You were supposed to nod. But something in you, quietly, in a place you don't discuss at funerals, recoiled. Not grief, not anger, something more precise. The feeling that the sentence was wrong, not cruel, not unkind. Wrong, factually wrong, in a way you couldn't name, in a way you had no language for, standing next to a casket that held someone who was 29 years old. You have been given that sentence your entire life, in different versions. God is testing you. This is part of his plan. Suffering builds character. He works in mysterious ways. It will make sense one day. You accepted them, not because you believed them entirely, because there was no alternative sentence, because the church gave you an answer and you had no reason to believe Jesus gave a different one. He did. He gave it twice, on record, in plain language, and you have never been shown it. His name was Daniel. 29 years old. We had met when he was 17. His first year in my history class, he was the kind of student who asked questions I wasn't always ready for. Not the annoying kind of smart, the genuine kind. He sat in the front row, took notes in a cramped sideways hand, and after class he would stay to push on the day's material. He ended up doing his undergraduate work in religious history. We kept in touch. When the diagnosis came, he called me. We talked for 2 hours. He was not afraid. Or if he was, he didn't lead with it. He was curious. He wanted to know if I thought there was a theological framework that made suffering meaningful. I told him I was still working on that one. 8 months later, I was standing next to his casket, the pastor's homily. A good man, a sincere man, someone who clearly loved Daniel and had sat with him through the worst of it, contained this sentence. God called him home because he had a greater purpose for him there. I stood in the pew with that sentence and didn't say anything. I drove home. I got to the desk and opened the concordance I've used since graduate school. A deteriorating Strong's with my initials pressed into the cover from 20 years of use. I typed a single word into the search bar. Suffering. I don't know why I went to the concordance that night. I had read the New Testament dozens of times. I had taught early Christianity for 12 years. I was not looking for something I had missed. But I was. I found John chapter 9, verse 1. And I read. And then I read again. When I first read it that night, really read it, as if for the first time, I had to put everything down. Not because it was new information, because I understood, for the first time in 20 years of study, what it meant that I had read it before and kept moving. Here is what the passage says. Jesus and his disciples are walking. They pass a man who was born blind. Not someone who lost his sight in an accident. Not someone who became ill, but a man who came into the world without sight. He had lived this way since birth. The disciples stop and ask a question. Rabbi, who sinned? This man or his parents, that he was born blind? This is not a theological question in the abstract. It is the question of suffering, the question of theodicy, put directly to Jesus. Who sinned? Who is to blame? What is the moral explanation for why this man's life began in darkness? The disciples are reflecting the dominant view of their time. In first-century Jewish thought, illness and suffering were widely understood as divine consequences for sin. The question has a built-in premise. Someone is responsible, the man or his parents. The suffering has a cause, and the cause is moral failure. Jesus' answer is 12 words. Neither this man nor his parents sinned. 12 words. That is the entire answer to the premise the disciples brought. Not, well, sin is complicated and in this case? Not, both factors are present, but the real lesson is, no, neither he nor his parents sinned. The premise is rejected, entirely, immediately, without qualification. The question of theodicy, why does this man suffer, is put to Jesus directly, explicitly, on record, in front of witnesses. And Jesus says, the suffering is not a moral verdict. The man was not born blind because of sin. His parents did not sin to produce this consequence. The entire framework the disciples were using, the framework that linked suffering to moral failure, is dismissed in 12 words. 12 words. The church built its suffering doctrine on a framework Jesus explicitly dismantled. And this was not a single moment. You have been given a formula your entire life, not an answer. God has a plan. This will make you stronger. He works in mysterious ways. Everything happens for a reason. These are not things Jesus said. Not one of them. Not in those words. Not in any equivalent construction. Not in any of the 4 Gospels. They are things the church said in Jesus' name. There is a difference. You have always sensed the difference, even when you had no language for it. Even when you were nodding at the funeral home, because nodding was the only available response, something in you recognized that the formula was not the same as the answer, that the comfort being offered was borrowed from somewhere other than where it claimed to come from. You were right. Here's what they never told you. Jesus was asked directly, twice, on record, and both times he gave the same answer, which is not the answer the church gave you. The second time happens in Luke chapter 13. 2 separate events, both involving sudden, violent death. Both happening in ways that would have prompted the standard first-century interpretation. These people suffered because of sin. The first, Galileans whose blood Pilate had mixed with their sacrifices. People who died violently, suddenly, during a religious act. The second, 18 people killed when the Tower of Siloam fell on them. A structural collapse. An accident, in the way we would use the word. Nobody ordered it. Nobody caused it through deliberate action. A tower fell, and 18 people died. Jesus is asked, directly again, whether these people suffered because they were worse sinners than those who survived. His answer this time is not 12 words. It is 2. I tell you, no, not qualified, not nuanced, not surrounded by theological clarification about the complexity of divine purposes. I tell you, no, 2 different contexts, 2 different types of death, 2 different conversations separated by time and location. Same answer. This is not a single off-the-cuff response. This is a pattern. When the same teacher gives the same answer in 2 different situations with 2 different questioners, that is a position. Not an aside. A position. And then, and this is the part that never made it into any homily I ever heard. After rejecting the suffering as sin framework both times, Jesus pivots immediately. He doesn't offer an alternative theological explanation for why the Galileans died or why the tower fell. He doesn't replace the wrong framework with a correct one. He rejects the premise and moves on. The question, why do people suffer, was put to Jesus on two separate occasions. Both times he said, not because of sin. Both times he declined to construct an alternative metaphysical explanation. The church took that silence and filled it with Augustine. But before we get there is something you need to understand about the Bible itself. Bart Ehrman is a New Testament scholar at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He was a committed evangelical Christian who studied at Moody Bible Institute and Wheaton College before pursuing his doctorate at Princeton Theological Seminary. He is now probably the most widely read popular academic critic of the canonical New Testament in the English-speaking world. In 2008, he published a book called God's Problem: How the Bible Fails to Answer Our Most Important Question, Why We Suffer. It is a systematic survey of everything the Bible actually says about suffering. His conclusion: the Bible does not have an answer. It has 6 mutually contradictory ones, arguments that cannot all be true simultaneously. The first answer, from the prophetic tradition: suffering is punishment for sin. You suffer because you or your community violated the covenant. God disciplines the people through historical catastrophe. This is Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos. This is the framework the disciples were working with in John 9. The second answer, from the apocalyptic tradition: suffering is caused by cosmic evil forces operating against God's will. You suffer not because God is punishing you, but because the world is currently under the dominion of powers that are not God's. In this framework, God is not the architect of your suffering. The third answer, from the book of Job: God permits the testing of the innocent. Job is not suffering because he sinned. He is suffering because God allowed it as a test. Job's friends represent the punishment for sin answer. Job himself and the book's framing undermines it. The fourth answer, from Ecclesiastes: suffering is unknowable and random. There is no moral architecture. The righteous suffer and the wicked prosper, and there is no discernible pattern. The preacher says this plainly and does not flinch from what it implies. The fifth answer, from early Christian theology: suffering is redemptive. Transformed by connection to Christ's passion, your pain becomes the mechanism of your spiritual growth. Augustine will build this. Gregory will complete it. And then there is the sixth answer, the one Ehrman identifies as categorically different from all the others. In this framework, suffering is the enemy, not the teacher, not the test, not the punishment, not the incomprehensible mystery of a God whose ways exceed human understanding. The enemy, to be eliminated. Jesus heals. That is the defining action. Across all 4 Gospels, across dozens of discrete encounters, Jesus confronts suffering and removes it. He does not explain it. He does not interpret it as divine pedagogy. He does not tell the blind man that his blindness is spiritually formative. He gives him his sight back. Ehrman's observation is precise. The Jesus of the Gospels, in his healing ministry, treats suffering as something that should not exist, an intrusion into the created order, something to be reversed wherever possible. The church had 6 answers to choose from. It chose the one that required the church. In the year 418 AD, the Council of Carthage issued a canon. 418. That is nearly 4 centuries after the death of Jesus. The canon: suffering, disease, and physical death are the direct consequence of original sin, the fall of Adam in the Garden of Genesis. All human suffering flows from that moment. It is inherited. It is universal. Nobody escapes it. And because nobody escapes it, Everybody needs what the church provides: the sacrament of penance, the mechanism of forgiveness, the institutional path back from sin to grace. The architect of this framework was Augustine of Hippo, born 354 AD in what is now Algeria. Brilliant, prolific, and by 400 AD the most influential theological voice in Western Christianity. Augustine was operating with a Neoplatonic philosophical framework that Jesus never used. The concept of inherited sin transmitted through human reproduction, the idea that the guilt and consequence of Adam's act passes to every human born afterward, is a construct Augustine built from Paul's letters in Romans chapter 5, filtered through Platonic philosophy about the soul and the body. Jesus never used it. When Jesus was asked why people suffer, he did not say, "Because Adam fell." He said, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned." Augustine cannot incorporate John 9 verse 3 into his framework without the framework collapsing. Because if the man born blind is not suffering due to sin, if Jesus explicitly rejects that interpretation, then the entire inherited sin as explanation for suffering architecture is contradicted by its own founder. The Council of Carthage canonized Augustine's framework in 418. It also declared any competing explanation heretical, including, structurally, the one Jesus gave. And then, as the Roman Empire fragmented and the Church consolidated its position as the organizing authority of European civilization, the framework became more useful, not less. It tied suffering to sin. Sin required absolution. Absolution required the Church. This was not theology in the abstract. It turns out the most powerful institution in Western history built its spiritual authority on a doctrine its own founder explicitly contradicted. Twice. On record. Think about the first time you really asked why. Not as a theological exercise, not with someone else's tragedy as the subject. The generic, distant suffering of the world that you could hold at arm's length and frame in terms of theodicy. The first time you asked with a name attached to the question. A specific person. A specific loss. A life that ended in a way that made no sense by any framework you had been given. Someone whose absence left a shape in the room that nothing has ever filled. The Church's answer arrived dressed in kindness, delivered by people who genuinely meant to comfort you. God has a plan. This is part of something larger. They are at peace now. God needed them more than we did. The words landed, and something in you, quietly, privately, in a place you didn't show anyone, did not accept them. Not because grief distorts judgment, because something in you recognized that the formula was not from the source it claimed. You filed it somewhere. You kept moving, because there was no alternative, and grief is not the time to begin dismantling the framework that everyone around you is standing in. The reason the answer didn't fit is not complicated. It didn't fit because it was not Jesus's answer, it was Augustine's answer, and Augustine was working 400 years after Jesus, with a philosophical framework Jesus never used, to build an institution that required suffering to be explained in a specific way. The sentence at the funeral was not wrong because it was unkind. It was wrong because it was not his. In the year 590 AD, a man named Gregory became Bishop of Rome. He is known as Gregory the Great. He reorganized the Western Church, established the model of papal authority that survived for centuries, and wrote extensively on suffering. His most concentrated treatment appears in his Moralia in Job, a massive 34-book commentary on the Book of Job. Gregory's addition to the framework: pain is not merely the consequence of sin. Pain is spiritually beneficial. God uses suffering as a tool to purify the soul, to correct spiritual defects, to produce holiness through affliction. His phrase, translated from the Latin, is this: The wounds of the soul are healed by the visitation of corporeal affliction. The wounds of the soul are healed by physical suffering. Now compare that sentence to what Jesus does in the four Gospels. Every time Jesus encounters physical suffering, he removes it. Not once, in any healing account in any of the four Gospels, does Jesus look at a sick person and say, "This suffering is purifying your soul." Not once does he recommend that someone continue suffering for their spiritual benefit. Not once does he suggest that the right response to illness is to allow it to complete its spiritual work. He heals. Every time. The healing is not a secondary action. It is the dominant response. The blind man receives sight. The leper is cleansed. The paralyzed man walks. Lazarus comes out of the tomb. Suffering in Jesus' recorded behavior is always the thing to be removed. Gregory built a doctrine that is the behavioral opposite of everything Jesus did. And that doctrine, suffering is spiritually beneficial, God uses pain to purify, became one of the most pervasive ideas in the history of Western Christianity. Because once suffering is spiritually beneficial, you stop trying to eliminate it. You start trying to justify it. The church stopped following Jesus' example and started explaining suffering in terms that kept people compliant. J.J. Benítez spent decades documenting what he calls the three-step institutional architecture of this process. Step 1. Tie suffering to sin. Everyone suffers. Therefore, everyone has sinned. Therefore, everyone needs the church's mechanism of forgiveness. Step 2. Make suffering spiritually meritorious. Suffering builds holiness. Endurance demonstrates faith. The person who bears pain without complaint is more spiritually advanced than the person who demands its removal. Step 3. Promise redemption after suffering. This life is temporary. The suffering you bear now will be rewarded in the life to come. Endure, submit. The reward is coming. Benítez argues, and I find it difficult to contradict, that this three-step architecture is not a theological position developed in good faith from the teachings of Jesus. It is an institutional control mechanism. Step 1 creates dependency. You need us to forgive the sin that caused your suffering. Step 2 discourages resistance. Your suffering is making you better, so don't demand its end. Step 3 requires submission. The payoff is later, not now. So stay obedient in the meantime. Jesus rejected step 1 explicitly, twice, on record. He practiced the opposite of step 2 in every recorded healing encounter. He never, in any recorded teaching, told anyone to accept present suffering for a future reward. The architecture is not from him. There is one more text I want to show you. Matthew chapter 5, verse 45. Jesus is teaching the crowd. He is describing the character of the Father, what the Father is actually like, in contrast to what religious systems tend to make him out to be. The sentence, "He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous." This sentence is doing something precise. Jesus is describing natural events, sunshine, rainfall, and explicitly disconnecting them from moral evaluation. The sun rises on evil people. The rain falls on the unrighteous. Environmental conditions are not moral verdicts. Natural suffering is not God sorting the deserving from the undeserving. The Father's love, Jesus says here, does not operate through selective weather. This is the direct inverse of the punishment framework. The punishment framework requires that suffering track sin. The worse you are, the more you suffer. Matthew 5:45 explicitly rejects this. Then there is the Abba framework. The word Jesus uses for God is Abba, Aramaic, not Adonai, the formal reverential address of the synagogue liturgy, the name spoken with distance and protocol. Abba is the word a child uses to address a parent, immediate, intimate. It implies a relationship in which access is not in question, in which the door is permanently open, in which the love is not earned or conditional. Benítez makes an observation about this across 10 volumes of Caballo de Troya that I haven't found stated as clearly anywhere in the academic literature. He says, the Abba framework makes pedagogical suffering internally incoherent. If the father is intimate, immediate, and personally engaged with each person the way a loving parent is engaged with a child, then a God who engineers suffering for spiritual pedagogical purposes is the God who inflicts cancer on his children to teach them patience. You do not do that to someone you love. The Abba framework and the pedagogical suffering doctrine are theologically incompatible. You cannot have both. Jesus gave us the Abba framework. Augustine and Gregory gave us the pedagogical suffering doctrine. One of them is from Jesus. The other is from two bishops working 4 centuries after Jesus died, with philosophical frameworks Jesus never used, to build an institution Jesus never built. And Benítez documents one more thing that I want to leave you with. In every healing encounter across his 10 volumes, his reconstruction of Jesus's ministry, Jesus never, in any recorded exchange, links illness or suffering to sin or moral failure. Not once. He does not ask the sick person what they did. He does not investigate the moral history of the family. He does not suggest that the suffering serves a purpose and should be endured longer. He heals. The healing is immediate, unconditional, and without theological explanation. Benítez's observation, this behavioral pattern, maintained without a single recorded exception, says more about what Jesus believed about suffering than any single quoted line. Jesus treated suffering as the enemy. Every single time. And it took the Church 4 centuries to reverse that. The concordance is still open on the desk. It has been open to the same page for 3 days. John chapter 9, verse 3. Neither this man nor his parents sinned. 12 words. I think about Daniel. I think about the pastor. A good man, a sincere man, who sat with Daniel through 8 months of cancer and loved him genuinely and stood at the pulpit and said the only thing the tradition had given him to say. God called him home because he had a greater purpose for him there. He did not know he was quoting Augustine. He did not know he was using a framework assembled 4 centuries after Jesus by a bishop in North Africa, using Neoplatonic philosophy to build an institution that needed suffering to be explained a specific way. He thought he was quoting Jesus, and that is the thing I keep sitting with. The people delivering that sentence, at funerals, at hospital bedsides, at 3 in the morning when someone calls who cannot stop crying, most of them are not lying. They are not cynically deploying an institutional control mechanism. They are giving the only answer they have, the answer the Church put in their hands. The answer the Church said was Jesus's answer. It is not Jesus's answer. Jesus's answer is in John 9 verse 3. It is in Luke 13 verse 3. It is in Matthew 5 verse 45. It is in the behavioral record Benítez documents across 10 volumes. A man who never, in any recorded encounter, linked suffering to sin, used suffering as a lesson, or told anyone that their pain served a purpose they should accept. The question of suffering was not left unanswered by Jesus. He answered it clearly, twice on record in explicit exchanges where the question was put to him directly. He answered it behaviorally, in every healing encounter, by treating suffering as the enemy to be removed rather than the teacher to be obeyed. The Church took that record and produced a different answer, an answer that served the institution, an answer that required the institution. And 400 years later, 590 years later, 1,000 years later, 2,000 years later, the sentence is still being delivered at funerals. God needed him more than we did. I have been sitting with John 9:3 for 3 days. 12 words. Neither this man nor his parents sinned. That is what Jesus said when he was asked. The concordance is still open. Still,